This is Lecture 2, Part 1 of 4, The Golden Age of Silent Film, 1918 to 1928. Here's some of the key points that we're going to be talking about in today's lecture. The Golden Age of Silent Film really only lasted about 10 years, from 1918 to 1928. The thing that made the Golden Age such an amazing time was really World War I. The First World War started in 1914, but the United States didn't get dragged until 1917. During the years before the United States entry, things were really difficult in Europe. And as you guys know, it takes a lot of manpower to make a film. But as you might not know, it also takes nitrate. Now, nitrate is not only a key ingredient in motion picture stock. I should say was. It's not used anymore. But it was a key ingredient for many years in motion picture film stock. It was also a key ingredient in making gunpowder. As a matter of fact, it's impossible to fight a modern war without nitrate. So what are you going to do? Make movies or make bombs and ammunition? Well, you guys know what won on that deal. But people in these countries didn't stop watching movies. They just started importing ours. And this allowed the American film industry to get ahead. Now, it's hard to believe, but before World War I broke out, approximately 30 to 35% of all films that played on American screens were imported. Most of those were from France. So for a brief shimmering moment, it looked like maybe France was going to become the world capital of filmmaking. But thanks to World War I, that didn't happen. Now, the Roaring Twenties, well, what do you think it was that made the Roaring Twenties roar? Money. It was a time of unprecedented economic expansion, and this filtered into the movie business. It was also the time of the studio system and the great moguls. So let's play a little clip and talk about them briefly.
Ruthless, conservative, tyrannical, even vulgar, the studio boss was the father figure of the system, sometimes possessed by an uncanny intuition for mass taste and a tireless devotion to studio production.
What was the studio system really about? Well, the studio system is something called a vertically integrated monopoly. Now, you can look that up in your old high school civics book if you want, but for the motion picture business, what it really meant is that they tried to own the business. One company tried to own the business pretty much from concept through production, through distribution, through exhibition. In other words, they tried to own as many elements of the business as possible. And this eventually allowed 10 companies to pretty much control the business worldwide. Well, not worldwide, but almost worldwide. 10 American companies, 5 major majors and 5 major minors. And sometimes they switched places. You know, one week maybe Universal would be a major, and the next week due to whatever the business brought, it might be a major, minor. But generally, it was the same players all the time. What allowed 10 companies to have such power? Well, the short answer is theater ownership. Now, I know what you're saying. You mean to tell me that every every movie theater in America was owned by a studio? No, the studios owned approximately only 16% of them at their peak, but they owned the best ones, the most influential ones, and everybody else, the independent theaters, fell into line pretty much. Let's put some faces with the names of these studios that you know so well. The man most closely associated with Paramount was Adolph Zukor. And Paramount Studios has been called the Cadillac of movie studios. It produced the big, expensive productions and created that kind of glamour that big budget films are synonymous with. Second was Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and the name most closely associated with that was Louis B. Mayer. Now, as the name implies, it was actually formed out of 3 companies, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. And Metro was known, Metro was the nickname for Metro Goldwyn Mayer. Metro was known as the glamour studio. William Fox was the king of the newsreel, but he was able to parlay this into becoming a powerhouse and producing narrative films for entertainment as well. Fox at one point almost became the king of Hollywood. He came very close in the late 1920s, but two events kept him from this. The first is that he was involved in a car accident in which he was severely injured, and the second was while he was in the hospital recuperating, his investments were exposed to a lot of risk, and the stock market crashed, the Great Depression, and really ruined Fox's hopes. In 1935, he was convicted of attempting to bribe a federal judge. When he died in the 1950s, not one single Hollywood producer visited his funeral. Jack Warner and his brothers were small-timers until they invested in a new technology called Vitaphone. And Vitaphone brought in talking pictures, which revolutionized the industry. We'll talk about that in an upcoming lecture. My favorite of the bunch, though, was Carl Laemmle Sr., affectionately known to his employees as Uncle Carl. And Uncle Carl's Universal Studios became a major player. We'll get back to Uncle Carl in a second. First, I want to talk about another system. It's called the Star System, and unlike the Studio System, the Star System is still with us. The Star System actually predates the motion picture business. It goes back to the days of the movie theater. I'm sorry, of the traditional theater. And the way it worked, of course, was a actor and actress is able to bring more people into the theater, then they're able to negotiate a higher price from the producer. Now, the old-time movie moguls were very, very aware of this, and they wanted to avoid it. They didn't want to have to negotiate with their actors and pay them more money. So there was a tacit agreement among many of the major studios that they simply wouldn't advertise their stars. Now, it's human nature to want to have your cake and eat it too, and this is exactly what happened in the case of Florence Lawrence. Somebody at Biograph got the idea of marketing her as the Biograph girl. This was genius because if she left and went to work for another studio, she would be sued. Whoever hired her would be sued, and Biograph in that respect can keep the name. And this worked really well for a while until a snake crept into the Garden of Eden. The snake's name was Uncle Carl. Uncle Carl bought up her contract and quietly leaked the details of her tragic death. And when the story reached its peak, Uncle Carl knew it hadn't been checked because the Biograph girl was alive and well, and he threatened to sue the New York Times. And the New York Times agreed, rather than to be sued, they agreed to print a retraction and also an advertisement that the Biograph's real name was Florence Lawrence, and you could see her upcoming movie that Uncle Carl had produced. Now, Uncle Carl had a great marketing scam and made a lot of money off this deal, but he'd also created a situation where Florence Lawrence now had bargaining power. People knew her name. And her earnings went from $250 a week to $5,000 a week in less than 3 years. But wait a minute, that's chicken feed. The highest paid actress of the day was Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford had started out in 1909 working for D.W. Griffith at $100 a week. But in 1917, she was making $15,000 a week and was the highest paid woman in the world, also the highest paid actress of the silent era. By the way, Mary Pickford's real name was Gladys Smith, and she was born in Canada. I always thought it was funny that America's sweetheart would be a Canadian. The other thing about Mary Pickford is she would eventually become a co-founder of United Artists Studio. We'll talk about that later. And this concludes Lecture 2, Part 1 of 4.